right now. So I realized that putting the core debate, the strategic debate frames, and the debate matter for the motion teams might be heavy in one session. So I've decided to just separate it. So instead, we will be talking about the core debate, the strategic debate frames this afternoon, and the matter for the selected motion teams in the morning, because there's just one session in the morning, which is judging. So I think it would be okay to do that as well so that we can focus since the lecture is quite heavy this afternoon. So I'll just share my screen. Uh, on. Yes. Can I get a confirmation that my screen is visible? Hello, is my screen visible? Sometimes it has a glitch wherein I don't seem to be able to share my screen, but for now, okay. So we'll talk about core debates. And the reason why I really want to give this lecture is that a lot of times some debaters do not really understand what the gist of the clash should be about. And what that does is that they give arguments that are not necessarily connected to the heart of the motion. And it makes a debate very conflated, and it expands the debate in ways wherein it should not be expanded because people are missing the mark. And that's why I want everyone, especially new and intermediate debaters, to really master the art of diagnosing the core of the debate, what really is the true burden of your side, and what really is the things that you should be defending in the round in the first place. Okay, so we'll also talk about strategic debate frames, i.e., in these types of core debates, how could you debate them or how could you approach them if you're in one side or if you're in the other side? Okay, so the core debate is essentially the most basic form of the debate. Kindly take note of the word basic. Basic, which means that it does not have any of the complexities that you add in a debate. So it's just the main clash. It's the truest, purest form of the nuance that you want to see in the motion. And it's the most intuitive tension in the motion. So imagine the earth. So this is the mantle, this is the crust. So the core is in the absolute middle. So it's what the debate should look like, absent everything that you add on top of it. It's just the core debate, the most intuitive form of the clash, according to what the motion would want us to debate. So imagine a war as well. So the wars are fought with tanks and nuclear weapons and missiles, etc. So behind all of those complexities, behind all the weapons in the wars, in the war's essence is just a conflict of ideology, two countries or two parties not agreeing about one thing. So that's the core thing, the core debate in that particular scenario, when everything else are added flavors like mechanisms, context, arguments, rebuttals, whatever. But the core debate is just the most basic, most purest clash, the absolute truest nuance of the motion. So it will take the form of X versus Y. What is the one value that X will be fighting for, or the other team will be fighting for? And what's the value that the other team will be fighting for, which is the Y value? So just the core debate, the absolute truest nuance of the round. Why is it important to learn the core debate and to understand what the core debate is and how you should be debating the core debates? So, core debates are useful in putting things into perspective because it ensures that your frame and strategy are correct. Sometimes, when you misunderstand the motion or when you don't really understand the truest form of the motion, people are going to argue frames that are really relevant or argue things that should not really be argued. And it conflates the debate, it confounds the debate, and it makes everything very confusing. And also, it makes sure that the context that you select are the ones that actually fit the context of the round. So yesterday we discussed about context building. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, the recording has already been uploaded. But you need to understand that the context that you choose should not be value neutral context. They should be biased contexts that bolster the arguments that you will give. And the only way for you to properly select the contexts is if you know what really is the debate about, what is the core clash in the round. Okay? Notably, it also reins in your argument and makes sure that it's relevant. So it prevents you from being boxed out. For instance, if you're in OG and then you had a very wrong understanding of the core debate, and then everybody else is talking about the actual debate, then you will automatically be boxed out and you will not be winning the round. Conversely, if everybody else in opening and the closing government is talking about the same thing, and you as closing opposition decided to be very crazy with your extension to the point at which you no longer understand the core essence of the motion, then you will automatically be boxed out because you are not debating the true spirit of the motion and the true clash in the round. Notably, the core debate and understanding what it is also clarifies the burden that you have to fight. Because sometimes teams waste their time defending burdens that they should not be defending. And that's bad because it eats up parts of your that could have been very meaningful. At the same time, if you don't understand your true burden and you're defending a burden that's not really the same one that is asked of you in the motion, then you probably will lose because the other team will burden push you. And when it's clear to the judge that you aren't defending your burden, they will feel that you're unengaging and that you don't understand what's happening in the round. Notably, it will also help you flag when your opponents are straying already too far from the debate. Sometimes it's your opponents that will not understand the core debate that's happening. And what that does is that you can expertly point out that they're straying too far and that they should be boxed out and should not be credited by the other team. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term boxed out is generally just a debate word or debate phrase wherein one team is irrelevant in the round because what they're saying is not connected to the other things that the other teams are saying. So everybody else is in agreement that this is what should be done in the round. And when one team is deviating from that part agreement, they are boxed out and they're seen as irrelevant. Notably, core debate is also a prerequisite or a requirement to developing good round consciousness. So what's round consciousness? Round consciousness is the ability to know how the round evolves and the ability to expertly detect what you should be doing in a particular speech so that you have the best chances of tipping the round to your favor. It's the ability to understand what needs to be done in your speech so that you can give your team the best chances of winning at that particular point in the round. The ability to analyze how the round evolves, what arguments are selling and are being bought by the judges at any particular moment, and thus understand what else you should supply and what you should be focusing on in that particular round. So the ability to evolve with the round is the simplest definition with round consciousness. And the only way you can evolve with the round, you can understand what's truly happening in the motion or in the round, is if you know the core debate. If you don't know what clashes should appear, then you won't know how to evolve and how to redirect the debate into the clashes that should appear. So, to put simply, knowing the core debate gives you the ability to detect and navigate the round as it goes, which means that you have higher round consciousness. And when you have higher round consciousness, you know how to prioritize the things that you should be doing at any point in the debate in order to optimize the team's chances of winning. Okay? Because you cannot just debate the thing that you prepped during the prep time, because of course the debate will evolve as different speakers contribute. So you need to evolve with a debate, and that starts with knowing what the core debate should be. Okay, so this whole lecture I will discuss 20 types of core debates and their strategic frames. So as we know, I'll just stop share now. I want to review what a frame is, and I will never get tired of reviewing what a frame is. So I'll just give me a second. Share screen. Okay, cool. So this is what a frame is. A frame is not one particular thing in the round. So you should not be allocating a fragment of your speech just for framing, because in essence, the frame should be in everywhere, in every part of your speech. The frame is essentially the summation of all the key insights and all the key intentions of all parts of your speech. So what is the intention of the context? What is the intention of the rebuttal? What is the intention of the arguments? And even the choice of words and even the non-verbal theatrics, like your verbal inflection and all of that stuff. Those commemorate and then culminate rather to the frame. because the frame is the key essence, the key message of everything. And the frame is the one that you want the judge to buy because it's the summation of everything. So remember our analogy in Inside Out 2, the memories of the orbs of memories are the arguments, rebuttals, context. And when these memories are floated in the lake, they form the belief system, which is a long strand, which is a summation of everything that you put into the link. So the frame is the key, the summation of the key insights of everything. So everything should have the frame. The context should carry the frame. The model should carry the frame. The levels of the rebuttal should carry the frame. The arguments and structural reasons should carry the frame. And even your nonverbal theatrics should be carrying the frame. It should be evident in everything so that it's pushed to the judge that this is different. So with that said, I hope that refreshes your memory on what a frame is. So let's go to the 20 types of core debates, which I feel is the most common. And because I scored through a lot of motions to be able to get them, so I summarized them based on 20 types of core debates and what frames you should be running if you're on either side. So let's go on to a debate, which is a clash between one team will be defending a stance that's principled heavy, principle, so meaning moral frameworks, rights, default rights of individuals, etc. And versus one team will be running a more pragmatic, heavy approach. Pragmatic meaning strategy, benefits, practicality, stuff like that. So again, principle, rights, pragmatics, benefits, and gains. Okay? So, for instance, in this motion, this House asks the LGBTQIA plus community in the Philippines would actively collaborate with the Catholic Church in queer acceptance. So, government will defend a very pragmatic, heavy view, such that in order for you to be to forward your rights as the queer community, then you need a powerful actor like the Catholic Church. So it's a pragmatic approach wherein they want to champion gains and champion benefits. Whereas opposition would not want that to happen because they don't want to collaborate with the Catholic Church. So you would assume that in this case, opposition will operate on a principled heavy approach because opposition would likely fight for the principle of not compromising your identity and not diluting your message of acceptance just because you want to gain the favor of the Catholic Church. So I hope that's clear. I'm not saying that only pragmatic arguments can be ran by Gov, only principled arguments can be ran by Op. Of course, any good case should have a mix of both principled and pragmatic. But in this instance, obviously, one side is leaning more towards principles and one side has heavy dependence on pragmatics for their win condition. Similarly, in this motion, this House believes that the feminist movement should abandon the men are trash narrative. Government would likely be fighting for the principle because they want to, the pragmatics, because abandoning the men are trash narrative would actually help you proselytize and promote your narrative to men and would actually gain a lot of men into your movement, which would then promote critical mass and then the ability to forward your causes. So it's a very pragmatic heavy approach. Conversely, opposition has a more principled heavy approach that no, the feminist movement at its core should stay true to its principles and should really resonate the notion that men are trash because men have abused a lot of women, etc. So as you can see here, there's a clear divide between both teams and that one team is more focused on principled and pragmatics. So I hope that you understand which kinds of debates that this kind of clash would, or this kind of core debate will likely appear. So what are the frames that you can run? If you're on the side champions, a more principled heavy approach, you need to say that the essence of your existence is to defend your principles. The summation of the key insights of all your contexts, arguments, and rebuttals could be something like this: that you exist, that you exist for your principles. And the moment that you forgo your principles, you're already worth nothing because you are formed and built by the ability to champion a moral framework and a moral truth that you know is right and just. So the moment that you forgo that ability to be true to yourself and true to what you stand for, then that's already something that you can't live with. You can also take a different approach, or maybe even integrate this approach with this, like with the other two frames, such that you frame and say that the most pragmatic thing to do is to stick to your principles. So you kind of flip the framing of the other team, right? Because the other team will champion pragmatism and benefits. And now you can say that actually the strategic thing to do in terms of gaining the benefits is actually sticking by your principles. You can talk about how the only way to retain the already existing subscriber base of the feminist movement is if you stay true to their principles. Because once you dilute your principles in the hopes of being more palatable to the moderates or the less extreme individuals, then you also discourage these already um, existing subscriber base from staying and still funding the movement. So you can flip and say that actually the most strategic thing to do is to actually follow the principles. So these are some of the frames that you can run. Of course, I cannot discuss all the arguments that you can emanate from these frames because we don't have the luxury of time. And also, that's your creativity as a debater. But I just want to tell you guys, like, what are the frames that you can run? What are the ideas you can start with in brainstorming? And what can be the overall summation of the key insights of your case, which is the frame in these kinds of motions. If you're operating on the side that's more pragmatic heavy, also, you have a lot of frames you can run. You can talk about how, one, your principles won't feed you, that humans have a visceral need to survive and to feed themselves, or even to be able to secure their existence for another day. And when you rely on your principles, sometimes they really won't feed you. You will starve to death and die and achieve nothing because of your principles. So you frame principles as a limiting factor from achieving the truest goal of your movement or of the actor in the round. The next one is that you can say that there are extreme circumstances that require you to abandon your principles in order to gain a pragmatic benefit. For instance, you can talk about how in the Philippines, there's already a lot of things like very, very discriminative actions towards LGBT plus communities in a lot of conservative areas. People are still being forced to endure hate crimes if you're an LGBTQ plus member. So that's why in these very extreme circumstances, you would be okay with letting go with some prongs of your principles as long as you gain the pragmatic benefit of forwarding your rights and forwarding tangible concrete solutions that address the problem. So you frame that this event exists in an extreme environment that necessitates you being able to let go of some of your moral high ground. The next thing to do is you can also flip the principled approach and say that actually doing the pragmatic thing is the morally correct thing. So as you can see, this side is championing principle, but you can go off their principle and say that the only principled thing is actually to gain the benefit and gain the tangible outcomes that you want, because compromise is key to a grander success. You can say things like, if you actually care about women's rights, then you're okay with not being so stubborn with your principles if it means that we can get more people to lobby for women having equal wages to men, having good benefits at work, having good pregnancy leave deals, etc. So you'll say that tangible outcomes are actually the basis for all the like actually fulfills the moral high ground that the other team is fighting for. So essentially, this is a way of engaging with the frame of the other team and saying that fine, even if this debate is about morality, then you would still win because the morally correct thing to do is to be pragmatic and strategic about it. You can also say something and frame your arguments to sound like stubbornness makes you look ridiculous. So your inability to compromise makes you look like an unreliable actor that will not gain support in the court of public opinions. So again, these are the frames that you can run for if you're in the principled heavy or the pragmatic heavy side in a debate where in the main clash, it's principle heavy versus pragmatic heavy. Do you have any questions for this slide? With that said, I'll move on to the next slide. Actor X versus actor Y is a core debate wherein both teams will be fighting for a separate actor. And they will both insist that this actor should be the one that should be prioritized and not the other actor. So again, it's when two teams are fighting for different actors and lobbying for the rights and liberties of these two actors. For example, this house would give indigenous people the absolute power to reject business activities proposed by companies who wish to operate in their communities. In this case, government will fight for indigenous people who will become actor X, and opposition will fight for other people, like the companies or whatever, who will serve as the actor Y. Next, this house regrets the rise of young figureheads in the movements, i.e., Greta Thunberg. So, figureheads or the leaders of the movements who are young, who are minors, even and in some cases, or people like Malala Yousafzai, for instance, who are very young. So, in this instance, no, opposite government, since this is a regrets motion, government will argue that the figureheads should be adults or old people, adults, which is actor X in this case. Whereas opposition will argue that the figurehead should be young people. So then young figureheads should be the Thunberg or actor Y. So I hope that it's clear that this is the actor X and actor Y. And this is the a core debate that pops up a lot. Okay, so now let's talk about frames that you can run. Firstly, you can say that we owe an actor certain reparations because we have oppressed them for far too long. So if this actor is the actor that you want to be painted in a good light, then you tell the judges and everybody in the room that these actors have been oppressed for far too long, which justifies our ability to pour them a lot of considerations, to pour them things like reparations, monetary incentives, or even added rights and privileges right now because of historical precedents that before we were oppressing them. And now it's our time to correct our mistakes that we have committed upon them. The next kind of frame that you can run is to say that the actor is the most strategic entity for the role. So you're going to say here that the actor is the only person who is able to fulfill the requirements of the job or who is able to complete the necessary prerequisite characteristics to fulfill a particular function. For instance, you can talk about how young figureheads are the ones that should be leading the movements because they are the ones who have a higher level of social consciousness. They are the ones who are techie and media, etc., who are able to modernize the messaging of the movement to appeal to a grander Gen Z market, for instance. The next frame that you can run is to say that this actor has the highest stake, and therefore, this actor should be the one that will actually fulfill that particular function. So in this example, you can talk about how the young figureheads have the highest stake because they are young. They will now live to see how the world will evolve 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50 years from now, because this is the world that they will inherit. Therefore, they have highest stake, and therefore they should be the ones that are in the movements. Conversely, to adults, they will probably die off already, or their lifespan is the remaining years of their lives will not be as plenty. So therefore, they won't live to see the world, and that thus they have lower stakes. So stuff like that. The next frame that you can run is that this actor deserves to suffer, and that this actor should be the one that will be sharing and paying for accountability measures. For instance, again, in the example, if the actor is the adult and you want the adult to be the head of the movement, you can say that no, they should lead the movement because they should suffer. They're the ones who damaged this earth 50 years ago by introducing things like industrial revolution that's not sustainable with the environment, stuff like that. They're the ones who made mistakes. So they're the ones who should be begging the world for forgiveness and correcting the mishaps that they have committed. So these are the frames that you can run to prove why actor X can be champion over actor Y or vice versa. Okay, so I would just like to caveat that all these core debates are not mutually exclusive. This is to say that core debate 1, principle versus pragmatics, can coexist with core debate 2, actor versus actor Y. And therefore, a lot of overlapping frames can be ran by both teams. But I just picked certain examples in this particular lecture that best represent the idea of that clash or if that core debate. I hope that's clear, and I hope that you understand it's not mutually exclusive and can be overlapping. The next core debate I'd like to discuss is short term versus long term. This is when one side will be fighting for more immediate solutions, even though they're more ineffective in the long term, versus one side will be fighting for more long term solutions and more sustainable solutions, even when they don't address the immediate needs and concerns on the ground. For example, this House asked developing countries would heavily invest in green tech. In this side, government side will be fighting for long term because they will invest in green technology, which can save our environment in the long term. Even though they're more expensive, they will be able to revolutionize the electricity and the current conduct of businesses in society in the long term. Conversely, opposition will be fighting for the short-term benefits that we do not want them to shift to green tech because there's going to be things like it's expensive that will compromise a lot of the budget for other more important things like the environment, the education, healthcare, etc. So there will be trade-offs and there will be costs that will kill the people on the ground. Okay, so what can you say if you are in the side that champions for short term? The frames you can run are, firstly, you can highlight the urgency and talk about our immediate needs are urgent and people are dying on the ground. So if it's a wartime scenario, you can talk about how women and children are being bombed currently, that people are starving in the drought, and that there are a lot of people whose needs are unfulfilled. So if you highlight the urgency, then that frames how the short-term solution is a necessary thing, even if it's just a band-aid solution. It will still save a lot of lives. Second, you can talk about how and frame your arguments in a way that say that long-term futures are useless if we will die before we get there. So if you already die right now because our immediate needs are left unfulfilled, then there's no point of thinking of a future because there's no future to begin with. The next frame you can run is framing that thinking long term is a luxury that we don't have. Frame long term planning as a luxury, as an expense that you cannot afford to shell out money for, and as something that you can't focus on right now. So these are the frames that you could run to highlight a short term, like why a short term approach is better than long term. How about for long term? There are a lot of frames as well. Firstly, talk about thinking long term prevents these disasters from happening again, which is predicated on the fact that perhaps the disasters right now are because of short term planning in the past. So, for instance, you can talk about how flooding in the current scenario is because people and politicians in the past did not think long term enough to invest in things like good drainage systems, good urban planning, or even good green technology or rescue technology. So we want to avoid future iterations of that disaster from happening in the future and then becoming an endless cycle over and over again. So that's why you can frame long-term thing as a good thing. The next frame you can run is to say that short-term solutions only exacerbate the problem. You can talk about how it only makes people feel like they are complacent because the problem has been solved, but the root of the issue really hasn't. So that complacency will exacerbate the problem. The next frame you can run is that our people deserve better. Appeal to the conscience of the judge and how we are unwilling to subject our population to the same kinds of very cheap solutions that will not last long because they deserve to break away from an endless cycle of suffering. And lastly, we can talk about how if it's not now, then when? And this is a subtle way of flipping the urgency narrative coming from short term and co-opting it and saying that if we don't do it now, then we will just be trapped in that cycle and long-term solutions and genuine change will never accrue. So these are the frames that you can run for short-term, long-term debates, which are quite a lot and are quite rampant these days. So I hope that you're able to understand the frames. And apart from the frames, and then you can expand the arguments. You can demonstrate like what the lecture I gave you on the first day. You can give structural reasons. You can use this as a basis of crafting your banner arguments and your context. Okay? So do you have any questions for short term versus long term? So if not, I'll proceed to the next frame. The next core debate, sorry, is private versus public. This is where one team is going to argue why private companies and private entities will be able to serve the function better, or allowing their entry into a particular field is the morally correct thing to do. And one team, the opposing team, will argue that no, public interventions and public operations are better. So things like services run by governments, run by states, etc. So for instance, in the motion, this House would nationalize financial institutions. Government will argue for the public because they want the states to be able to gain full control over the banks, over pension systems, and even insurance systems. Whereas private, like opposition, will want private because they're okay with the current status quo, wherein banks are, a lot of them are private, and there are a lot of things like private institutions in pensions and insurances. For the next motion, this House would ban private housing. Government is for public because they are fighting for the fact that national housing, or the government controlling all the housing, should be the good thing, whereas opposition is in private because they want to have things like private real estates, private subdivisions, etc. Next, in countries with high rates of drug abuse, this House would nationalize the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of drugs. So in this case, government will be fighting for public again because they want the state to be able to manufacture, distribute, and sell drugs instead of having private institutions doing that. And opposition is obviously private. Okay, so what are the frames that you can run? If you're on the side that champions for private, firstly, you can say and frame the government as the most incompetent actor that you will ever encounter in your life. You can talk about things like they're bureaucratic, rigid, self-interested, corrupt, and unpoliceable when there are flaws. Bureaucratic because it takes very long to take actions done. Rigid because the policies are immalleable, and sometimes the only recourse you can have is impeaching a current president and hoping that the next election, a good one, will replace them. You talk about how the government is corrupt, there's political dynasties, and even it's unpoliceable because they hide their flaws through a layer of bureaucratic and power-tripping mechanisms. So just frame the government as the absolute most incompetent disaster of an actor that could potentially serve a function. Next is that you can frame your arguments and say how the government, how everything that the government touches will always crumble. So talk about in PGH, wherein national hospitals are very poorly managed, things like Land Bank, a bank that has very poor mobile banking and digitalization efforts, or even things like PhilHealth, which are national insurance systems that are prone to scandals and corruption, stuff like that. Next is that you can also frame how being profit-driven is a good thing, because since you're a private institution, and of course, you are profit-driven, then you can talk about how profit-driven leads to things like the drive to beat out competition, which means that you're able to accelerate the feedbacks of individuals to give more service, blah, 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 because of course they want to retain their consumers so that they have every incentive to make sure that the service is good, well, and properly provided. The next frame that we can run is to say that monopoly is the death of agency, because if it's just the state doing it, then there's no competition. You eliminate all the private individuals and individuals who can challenge the state and give a counterfactual of what it would be like if it's a private institution handling it. So when there's only one option, because it's the state, then people are not able to choose. They don't have the agency to be able to select the services they want. And monopoly breeds the lack of urgency to fix issues because there's no other choice anyway and there's no competition. Conversely, if you're on the side that champions public efforts, then these are the frames that you can run as well. Firstly, you can talk about private companies and how they are evil to the core. So perhaps you can use examples like the companies that are very corrupt, like NutriAsia, Jollibee, or transnational corporations that have all the incentive to oppress their workers And that's why you can frame these companies to be evil. And you can also talk about how they're good at hiding their stuff because they can afford lawyers and leaps of legal maneuvers to be able to exploit loopholes and be able to leave unscathed. The next thing you can do is you can frame how being profit driven, because companies are profit driven, will inevitably corrupt any good intention. So fine, even if we're willing to concede that some of these intentions are good and some of these people in the company are not evil, the fact that you're profit driven will drive you crazy and will drive you to do unspeakable things for the sake of profit. That means cutting wages, even foregoing things like corporate social responsibility to save on money, or even offering substandard products so that you can cost cut and stay afloat in midst of crisis. Next, you can also flip the characterization from the other team and say that monopoly leads to streamlined efficiency. So if there's just one central figure or one central entity providing the service, then that entity will become so streamlined and so good because they don't no longer have to invest on anything to beat out competitors, but rather they now have all the luxury to invest on services that they know will improve the company because of monopoly and because they know that they have a steady cash supply and cash inflow. Next is that you can talk about how the governments are the ones that know the people on the ground because these are politicians who campaign and go to a lot of places. The government has access to centralized data to best analyze what the population needs, etc. So therefore, they understand the needs of the people, which translates to things like better service, etc. So and you can also talk about how the government is actually more beholden to the people because it's the government that has been elected by the people on the ground. And therefore, we have more better incentive to make sure the service is better. So these debates are very common, no? They come in the form of words like nationalizing, banning something private, or even removing all private contractors, stuff like that. So in all of those debates, you can use frames like this. Okay, so the next core debate that I want to analyze and discuss is the environment versus the economy. Wherein one side will be fighting for what's good for the environment, and the other side will be fighting for what's good for the economy and how to uplift the economy. For instance, in these motions, this house would stop all mining operations. Of course, government will be fighting for the environment because they want to stop mining, and mining is bad for natural resources like mountains because it entails and connotes to operations like quarrying that can cause landslide and the destruction of natural habitats of animals. Whereas the opposition will fight for economy because mining can provide jobs, can provide economic security, and can even uplift the country to poverty by raising the gross domestic product. Whereas in the next motion, this house would boycott companies with a history of severe environmental damage. Then government will argue obviously for the environment because they're boycotting companies and they're doing extreme actions to be able to hold these companies accountable. Whereas opposition will be fighting for economy because they probably will run frames that support these companies and the good that they do because they provide jobs. So boycotting them will also affect and displace a lot of lives and people on the ground. So what frames can you run in both sides? If you're on the side that is lobbying for the environment, the frames that you can run include, firstly, talking about how the environment is all that we have and we will die without it. So protecting the environment is in our best interest because we only have one Earth. And at the point at which that's destroyed, then we also die as human beings. So you hammer in the agency and you hammer in the finite extent of damages that we can do to the environment. Next, you can talk about how we are down to our last straw and we are out of chances. So at the point at which we don't um, succeed in making immediate changes right now, then we probably will die in the future and the environment will not be able to keep up with the massive abuses that humans induce. The next frame that we can run is talk about how we're supposed to be the stewards of the environment. In a principled extent, we were supposed to champion Earth because the contingency of being able to live in the world is also there's an unwritten agreement that you take care of that environment and that Earth So we cannot fail and mess up as stewards because we're the only ones it has. And we have already derived so many benefits from it. So therefore, we should be able to give back to it and conserve it. The next frame you can run is a principled and a more radical extent of the principle, which is to say that humans are mere tenants of Mother Earth, and humans are useless tiny beings in the small, small speckles of the universe. And the Mother Earth is literally the end all be all of everything. So the fact that we're tenants makes us feel like we don't have rights to be able to destroy it because we're only borrowing its resources and it's only letting us live here. The next, conversely, if you're on the side that champions economy, here are the frames you can run. You can talk about how economic progress and environmental conservation can coexist. So you can go hand in hand with this one, no? So, of course, if you're on the side of champions economy, you can talk about how all the proceeds of our economic ventures can also go back to the environment and conserving forests, all that stuff. Or you can also talk about how there are regulations. So, for instance, you can also do mining, but only in approved areas or sites wherein the damage has been calculated to not be as severe or that the damage can be repairable. So we're not going to do irreparable harms. So you can do things like the champion economy without sacrificing the environment. But also, before I forget, if you are the side of champions for the environment, you can also flip economy and say that once the Mother Earth had already been depleted, that's when you're no longer going to be able to harvest natural resources, and that's when your economy will dip because you're no longer able to provide the resources for your country. So you can flip, and that's the essence of debates because, like I said on the other day, that frames it's not just enough to outframe the opponent and to say why your frame is the best one. You should still be able to engage on the frames of your opponent and operate under terms, play the debate under rules, and still be able to prove why you will win. So going back to the frames, if you're on the side of economy, you can also talk about how people are dying and we must feed them now. So this is an argument that in principle would really work as well because you're talking about how there are concrete individuals on the ground that are foregoing lives and liberty. So therefore, we could really use the updraft in our economy to be able to help them. The next frame that you can run is talk about how good economy yields environmental conservation, which is the thing that I talked about earlier. So these are the things you can run in a debate for environment and economy. Do you have any questions under this core debate? Okay. Ponce?
Hi, coach. So I made an example on like the motion discussed with stop all mining operations. You said that like economic progress and environmental conservation coexist, and that you gave an example where like the policy of the I think the counterfactual piece of the opposition would be like, okay, yeah, we'll allow mining, but only with like strict or like heavy regulations. Like my question is like, how can you like not make it appear as a soft stance, so to speak?
Okay. So two answers to that. Very good question. Firstly, you say that it's not a soft stance because putting regulations to something means that you're still allowing it. So in essence, you're still debating the spirit of the motion. So perhaps you can mechanize what the regulations would look like, who will enforce it, what the penalties will be. But secondly, and this is very important, is still to engage on your absolute on the frame of the other team. So if they're framing that in your side, your burden should be engaging to the full extent of really not having any regulations, not having whatsoever checks and balances. Then you can say that fine, we'll engage on that and still say things like perhaps number one, we're okay with the environment being damaged irreparably as long as we're able to feed the poor people on the ground right now because if we wait for far too long, we're essentially killing off these individuals because we're not doing anything because of our complacency. But also, just a small note on the first thing that I said. You can say that regulations and the existence of them is not a soft stance by parallelizing it to other industries. And parallelizing is a very good way of getting your point across without spending too much time on it. For instance, number one, like we legalize things like tobacco, but that doesn't mean that we're just not getting regulations implemented, that doesn't mean we're selling it to children. There are regulations like we limit the sale of tobacco to certain demographics, that we have a ban on advertising tobacco freely on billboards because of the DTI rules and regulations, or even other things like, for instance, we legalize the ability to be a surrogate parent, for instance, in a lot of countries. But that doesn't mean that you don't have regulations. That doesn't mean that you don't select who will be the surrogates and if they're mentally and physically fit for a particular job, etc. And that doesn't mean that you don't have contracts and safety nets to prevent both parties from damages. So you can talk about how regulations does not mean that it's a soft stance, because it's normal for regulations to exist in all industries wherein we are permitted to operate. But again, on the second note, in the absolute worst case, still engage and push it to the margin, to the extremes, and bite the burden. Is that clear, Ponce? Do you have any other questions?
Yep. Thank you so much, Coach.
Thank you. Okay, so next, let's go on to the next core debate, which is diversity and uniformity. This is when one team will argue that multiple identities and the diversity of identities and narratives is good, whereas one team will argue that if everything is uniform, if the identities and narratives are uniform and congruent to one another and easily agreeable to one another, then that's when you have a more efficient system going on. For instance, in this motion, this House prefers the election of cabinet secretaries over appointment-based system. Government is going to argue for diversity because they want a cabinet secretary, like the Department of Health secretary, the Department of Education secretary, to perhaps have the option of having a different party than the president. Because since it's elected, it can be that a PDP Laban president will sit in Malacanang, but like a liberal party or an Angat Buhay party person will be actually sitting in as DOH secretary or as DA secretary, etc. Conversely, opposition will argue for uniformity because they would want a world where it's the president who actually chooses everyone in their cabinet. So in essence, it's a more homogeneous group because of course, who the president will choose will probably align to their values and virtues and will not contradict them throughout the 6-year term. The next example is this House prefers a world without identities. So government is fighting for uniformity because they want to have a world where people don't have hair colors and races and genders, etc. So it's a very homogeneous world. Whereas opposition wants diversity because they want a world wherein people have identities and people actually have a sense of individuality. The next motion is this House regrets the segmentation of the feminist movement, i.e. the existence of trans feminism and Islam feminism. So in this case, side government is going to argue for uniformity because they want a big collective feminist movement, i.e. it's just one feminist movement. Everybody is just going to be under a big umbrella of the feminist movement. Conversely, side opposition will argue for diversity because they want a world wherein the feminist movement is still subdivided into multiple, more unique mini movements that have their own nuances and their own identities, such as trans feminism for trans women, Islam feminism for Muslim women. So they want a more diverse interpretations of the feminist movement. So I hope it's clear what this clash looks like, what diversity versus uniformity looks like, and what their corresponding debates actually look like. So now let's go to the frames that you can run in both sides. If you're on the side that champions diversity, you can run a frame that says, our unique identities give us power and sense of self makes life worth living, such that if you don't have a unique identity, that's when you're powerless as a person because your power stems from who you are and your power stems from the unique things that you can offer into the table. The second thing you can say, and your frame could be, genuine unity and empathy are bred through diversity. And this is a value that co-opts a lot of uniformity's claims. Because of course, the argument of people from uniformity is to say that uniformity makes people understand each other because they're the same or they have the same beliefs, etc. And you can flip that by saying that, no, actually, genuine unity and empathy only happens when a diverse group of people learn to compromise, learn to be able to converse and negotiate with one another so that they will be able to achieve a mutual and shared goal. So that's when you can really exercise empathy because you're forced to understand the perspectives that might not initially align with yours. The next thing that you can say is that diversity is strategic in gaining buy-in. You can talk about how if a lot of people, for instance, like in trans feminism, Islam feminism, if there are different, more unique segments of the feminist movement, that's when a lot of people will feel represented and they're far more likely to join the movement. Because Islam women could feel that they have a space in the movement, for instance, or trans women will have a space in a particular movement, and that's why they're more likely to join and opt in. So in terms of pragmatics, you can run this frame as well. The next frame that you can run is to say that university dilutes the message by overlooking nuances. You can talk about how in the quest to be so homogeneous and to be so uniform, there are a lot of perspectives and narratives that we fail to consider, even when they're worth considering. For instance, if we only have one big feminist movement, then we're not able to consider the unique struggles and unique plights of trans women, of Muslim women, or other kinds of women who have intersectional struggles. So by making it so uniform, you're not able to serve the best interest of your population because you're diluting them and their identities. The next thing you can say, and which is a preemptive frame, is to say that biases will exist either way, and humans are horrible people regardless. Because of course, you would understand and you would think that the uniformity team or the team arguing for uniformity would say that more wars are caused by the differences and the diversities of individuals on the ground. Then talk about how the biases will exist. So even if everybody is uniform, people will find a way to discriminate somebody. Like is it geographic location on how they live, etc. Or is it socioeconomic standing? Diba? Even if everybody has the same gender or same race, people will still discriminate based on location, based on standing in society, whatever. So therefore, biases will exist, and we'd rather have a world wherein biases exist, but at least we have our own identities and sense of individuality. Okay, so the next frame that we could run, in the side of uniformity, is to say that uniformity is a pragmatically strategic thing because it ensures public buy-in. So you can talk about how you're able to consolidate, for instance, the trans feminists, the Islam feminists into one big movement if you're uniform. And what that does is you're able to have a critical mass immediately. And you're able to lobby for more things that are able to benefit a lot of women. So you have more buy-in because you're collapsing a lot of identities, and therefore you're not dividing them into smaller sections. You have power in numbers, and even when that identity is diluted, you're still able to have critical mass to make change happen. The next frame you can run is to say that uniformity removes biases and promotes unity, and that you can talk about how biases stem from things like differences in gender. That's why there's sexism, differences in religion. That's why there's a lot of discrimination that are faith-based, discrimination in race. That's why racism exists. So if everybody is uniform, etc., or like if everybody is under one big label, there's less incentive to fight and fragment. The next thing that you can say is that diversity leads to the cultivation of hate because when everybody is different, that's when people and friction arises. And that's when things like insecurities, things like seeing somebody as inferior to you arises. And also, you can also talk about how and flip this narrative of diluting the message. You can talk about how uniformity is actually the best way to concentrate the message. Because when you're too diverse and when you have two small segments of one another, that's when you're not able to send the message across because you're so hyper compartmentalized that you're not able to consolidate and have one big message that's resonating and overarching towards a population. So that's the frames that you can run for diversity and uniformity clashes. Any questions under this one? Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the next frame that for debate we can tackle is extreme versus relaxed. And this is when one side is fighting for a more extreme intense or a more meticulous type of action that is more hardcore and more pushy. Whereas one side is fighting for something more relaxed, looser, something less meticulous, and something more liberating. That's action. Okay? So, for instance, in this motion, this house believes that helicopter parenting has done more harm than good. So, for context, helicopter parenting is tiger parenting essentially, wherein the parents really become so meticulous on the child's activities, really become so hands on and present in every single aspect of their child's life, and even controlling a lot of the things that your child can and can't do. So the opposite of helicopter parenting is free range parenting, which is essentially you're a more hands off, more lenient, more relaxed parent, and you like you seek that your child explores the world independently and that they also make their own mistakes and also be able to learn from them as well. So of course, in this world, government is fighting for government is fighting for a relaxed the more relaxed approach because you don't like you feel that there's more harm in helicopter parenting, and in contrast helicopter parenting is the more extreme approach. So what are frames that we can run? Number one, you can talk about in the extreme side that the likelihood of deadly harms accruing is so high that extreme actions are absolutely necessary. So you're talking about how people will be harmed and the individuals will be harmed if there's no extreme actions. So here, your goal is to um, make the likelihood of harms and the intensity of harms so high that it justifies a very extreme approach. For instance, you can talk about how a lot of evil people will be around your child. A lot of evil people will be able to take advantage of them when they grow up. So, with that likelihood of harms, then it's within your interest to pursue helicopter parenting and to know where they are and what they do at any moment. The next frame we can run is to say that achieving our dreams and aspirations requires extreme commitment. That the only way to achieve the ultimate good and the ultimate goal of the debate is to be able to endure something harsh and something restrictive, even if it's suffocating at times. For instance, helicopter parenting. So the only way your child will be able to achieve the best versions of themselves is to become very focused in raising them, even if it means you're a strict parent. The next thing that you can run is to say that relaxed actions equate to dangerous complacency. So when you're not doing anything, that means that you're complacent about something. And when you're complacent, you're not going to do or you're not going to be attentive to all the issues and problems. And that complacency will lead you to harm and will lead you to rot. Next, you can also flip it in terms of morality and say that when you commit anything less than extreme, that now it becomes very morally abhorrent because it's your moral duty, for instance, as a parent, to be so stern in raising your child. Because once you're too lax with your child, when anything happens to them, or where they're not ready for life in the long run, then you are a failure as a parent. And that's a morally abhorrent thing to do as someone who chose to give or to breathe a life into this world by having a child. In contrast, if you're on the side that champions for more relaxed approach, you can also run frames like number one, extreme actions are ironically the ones that perpetrate the harms they seek to avoid. So you can talk about how in the quest of wanting to safeguard your child or the actor in question, for instance, from all the harms and the atrocities in the world, pushing them in very extreme actions and doing something really harsh could actually be the one that is the cause of the harm. For instance, if your goal as a parent, that's why you become strict, is so that the child is not taken advantage of by other people and you spare them from the emotional trauma, maybe the extreme action of helicopter parenting and being a tough tiger parent is actually the source of the trauma. And it could actually be the one to make your child suffer in the long term. Next, you can run a frame saying that experiencing, oh, what happened? Anyway, sorry. Okay, so you can run a frame saying, oh, my screen is still visible, right? Just checking. May I ask for confirmation that my screen is visible? Hello? Because I'm not
It
sure.
is, coach.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So next, Next, you can run a frame that says experiencing life to the fullest is necessary to become a self-actualized person. That is, if you have a restricting force, such as a helicopter parent, you won't be able to experience the things that you need to do to become who you are as a person. You can also talk about how extreme actions breed resentment. So if you're going too extreme on something, then the person will hate you, the person who is the recipient of that extreme action, because maybe you have cut off all of their liberties and their ability to enjoy their lives. The next way you can do that is to flip this particular frame from the extreme and say that there's actually no impetus for extreme actions because the world is not such an evil place, that the world can be a good place, and that a lot of measures are already in place, a lot of safety nets are already there. So there's no need for you to do something very extreme, and it's not justified to begin with. So these are the frames that you can run for extreme versus relaxed core debates. So any questions about this one? Okay, if not, I will proceed to the next. So the next type of core debate is open versus protectionist. These are debates. Oh, these are debates where in one side is fighting for a more open approach. That is, people are there, or sorry, you're allowing access to your region, to your place, or whatever, to other people or to other entities, to other countries, etc. Whereas protectionist is more isolationist, that you don't want to open your borders, open your opportunities, open your gates and your mindset to other ideas, individuals, or entities. So, for example, in this motion, this House as developing country would embrace trade liberalization. So trade liberalization means that you're allowing people to go to and from your borders, you're opening routes for trade and commerce, and you're able to also import and export a lot of things to and from other countries. So obviously, for government, this is a open. They're fighting for open because they are okay with trade liberalization and they're okay with opening their borders to other countries for trade. Whereas in opposition, they're fighting for protectionist tendencies because they don't want to open their borders and they want to remain only producing their own things in their own land and everything. Okay, so kindly remember this type of that type of core debate because this is a quite common core debate as well. So let's go now. So what are the frames that you can run in the open if you're in the side that champions for open or openness? First, you can talk about how the global connection and integration is the safest path towards economic progress. Talk about how there's so much to be gained when you get to have the resources of other countries. You can also import things like raw materials so that they can outsource processing to them because they have better industries that are more equipped for high scale production. However, this will increase your GDP, so that's still good for you. Stuff like that. So you frame global connection as the best and safest path to economic progress. You can talk about how other paths are not very safe. So if you're relying on your own domestic industries, when at the point at which there's no market demand for the products you're already producing because there's plenty of those natural resources in your own domestic country, then that's going to lead to market collapse if you don't open and liberalize your trade. The second frame you can run is to say that refusal to be open is a clear path to a nation's stagnation and damnation. So you can talk about how if you're very insular as a nation, then you won't be able to progress because you won't be able to go out there and be able to really profit from your natural resources. The next frame you can run is to say that isolation is the exact opposite of what nations must be doing when managing international relations. So even when the motion is not strictly international relations, for instance, in this particular motion, it's trade liberalization. You can still connect the concept of international relations when you're talking about countries because no, when you don't trade with other countries, you are far less likely to gather strong and important allies in their shores. So you're not able to really forge connections with them. And what that does is in times when you're in need of help in disasters, calamities, or maybe you need military backup for wars, etc., then you're not able to get that for them. So you have low legitimacy in the international arena. Okay, so what are the frames that we can run? Conversely, if you want a protectionist approach. So the first frame you can run is to say that investing on your own resources is the only way to meaningfully elevate the status and economy of the country. So elevate, no? So you can say, and this is a flip of this one. So you can say that no, you can talk about how global markets are unreliable and you're actually just not profiting that much because a lot of these countries are going to buy your products cheaply from you and then mark up the prices high on their own countries. So because of that, you're far more likely to be better off just investing on your own economies, like investing on your own agriculture, etc., to feed your own domestic population, as opposed to relying on other countries to buy your products for you. The next frame that you can run is to say that dependence makes a country weak. So when you're so dependent on other countries because they're the main clients of your resources, what that does is that number one, you become very beholden to them. So you're more likely not going to be able to resist them if they ask for things from you. So for instance, if they ask for certain territories or if they ask for unjust and unfair favors, since your economy is literally contingent on their support, then you're far unlikely to resist them. And that creates a sense of beholdenness and submissiveness to that country. Next, we can talk about how openness actually equates to devaluing and neglecting the country's potential for self-sufficiency. So when your mindset is already that, oh, we should globalize, we should expand our networks to foreign shores, then you're no longer able to fully analyze and fully realize the potential of your own country to be making money and become self-sufficient. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, such that when there's no focus and attention, that it connotes to these countries not being able to really pour effort and emphasis on those industries. And that's where they will forever be dependent to foreign countries. So these are the frames that you can run for debates that are open versus protectionist or core debates. Are there any other questions about this? Okay, so with that said, I'll proceed to the next one, which is the core debate on redeemable versus hopeless. So in this core debate, one side is fighting for a particular actor still being redeemable, i.e., maybe this actor has done some bad things in the past, but ultimately they can still be a source of benefit and can still be used as an ally in these particular times. Conversely, the other side will be fighting for the hopeless side, which means that they will fight for the fact that this actor is already evil beyond repair, that there's no point in working with this actor, and that this actor is hopeless and will not give us any sort of benefit, or that it's principally incorrect to work with this actor because of all the bad things that they have done before. So even morally, they can't have any sort of redemption anymore. So now let's go on to our for like our examples. Firstly, this house would rehabilitate convicted terrorists. So of course, the government will be fighting for the redeemable side because they believe that convicted terrorists can still be rehabilitated and can still re-assimilate to society, whereas opposition is fighting for hopeless because they feel that these convicted terrorists have already done so much damage in society that we should not expend effort and labor in actually rehabilitating them. The next motion is this house believes that the IMF or the International Monetary Fund, which is a funding body that can grant loans to a lot of countries in the international arena, no, should require collaterals. Collaterals meaning conditional items that once the loan is not paid or once the debt is not paid, IMF will collect that item instead. So, for instance, if the country loans, they will like put up an island as a collateral, for instance. So once the country is not able to pay, the island is going to be the IMF's property, and IMF is free to sell it to whatever country wishes to buy it. So this house believes that IMF should require collaterals when bailing out countries in debt. So of course, no government is actually fighting for hopeless because they think that these countries are already hopeless, that we should require to them collaterals because they cannot pay. So therefore, collaterals are absolutely necessary. Whereas opposition is fighting for redeemable because they're essentially saying that these countries can still be able to pay. So therefore, there's no need to resort to things like providing collaterals. The next motion, this house as a developing state would prefer to use the use of neutral aggregate currency to the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So a neutral aggregate currency is basically a mean of like is a new currency which whose value is the mean of all other currencies in that particular computation. So if the neutral currency is the aggregate currency of dollar, of Canadian dollar, of US dollar, of baht, of peso, of whatever, then the mean value will now become the neutral aggregate currency's value. Whereas US dollar, of course, US dollar. And then the global reserve currency is basically if all the money in the world like runs out or if there's a shortage of cash, then the global reserve currency, which will be traded in, will be the one that will be used. So is it better if it's a neutral aggregate currency or is it a US dollar currency? So of course, government would be fighting for hopeless because they want a neutral aggregate currency because they think that US is already a bad actor and therefore should not be granted the ability to make the power of dollar more powerful. Whereas opposition is fighting for redeemable because they think that the US, although being a bad actor, is still redeemable and their currency can still be a good way to reserve a good currency to serve as the global reserve. So what are the frames that you can run if you're redeemable and if you're hopeless? So let's go with redeemable first. Firstly, you can say that the bad actors still have the ability to be good if given the chance, such that these terrorists can still be able to rehabilitate in society when they have the chance, or the US can still be able to be good to us when they have a chance, or even countries that are so sinking in that already can still pay when they have the ability and they're given the chance to do it. Second, the strategy is to say that bad actors, no matter how bad, are still deserving of considerations. So you can talk about how even if they're convicted terrorists, they're still deserving of human rights. So in essence, we should still be able to try to rehabilitate them, right? So even if these very poor countries are very bad at keeping up with their dues and their debt, that they still are deserving of considerations because they are still countries that are still just trying to do what's best for the people on the ground. Okay? So next is that bad actors are merely victims of circumstance. So you frame how the bad actor's bad actions is just because they were left with no choice or they were victims with really bad they were dealt with bad cards to begin with. That justifies the action. For instance, you can talk about how a lot of convicted terrorists are just brainwashed laborers like farmers or fishermen who were promised to be given high salary if they are able to enact this particular action commanded by the radical group, or that some terrorists, for instance, are brainwashed religiously by the doctrine of their church, and therefore they are just victims as well. Or perhaps talk about how other poor countries are just victims of circumstances like recessions, pandemics, and the debt trap diplomacy or scammy practices dealt to them by other richer countries where they loan, etc. So what this effectively does is curtails the notion that these actors are hopeless. The next frame that we can run is talk about bad actors and strategic partners. Also talk about how US, despite how it's bad, can still be a strategic ally and is still a relatively stable country. So having their US dollar as a global reserve currency is still a good thing. Or talk about how bad actors become worse if we choose to not work with them. So if we don't work with developing countries, they will end up in very, very bad conditions. Or if you don't work about terrorists, they might harbor sentiments of revenge and will likely still do harm in society. Conversely, if you're on the side that talks about how these actors are already very hopeless, there are plenty of frames that you can run as well. For instance, you can talk about how these bad actors are already evil beyond repair. So no matter what you will do to rectify and help them, to be able to correct them and put them in a proper moral path, they are already so evil that it's not worth it anymore, or that whatever efforts will not work. Okay? So secondly, you can talk about how giving them the chance is actually a slap to the face of those people whom they have oppressed and victimized. So for instance, if it's a convicted terrorist, then giving them the chance to be rehabilitated actually will make the individuals on the ground that suffered the wrath of these terrorists not feel like they have achieved justice. They will feel like justice is yet to be served and that they have been shortchanged by the government. Or, for instance, if it's the US, if you give US more power, then that will give more countries like the Afghanistan or whatever that US has done wrong to or has wronged in the past feel like there's no justice and it's principally incorrect. You can also talk about pragmatics and perhaps frame your arguments in a way that working with bad actors will expose us to the risk of suffering the same cruel fate again. So you can talk about how these actors already have the history of being so bad. So likely they have recidivist tendencies or tendencies to go back to the previous actions and still induce harm onto us. So therefore, we'd rather just preserve our safety and not run the risk of being victimized yet again by these other actors. So I hope that is clear what this looks like on the way. Okay, so now let's go to, okay, sorry, any questions on redeemable versus hopeless? So I hope you understand that this can take many forms of motions, and basta the core debate really is this one, that one actor is either redeemable or hopeless. Now let's go to one versus many. One versus many is when one side is fighting for the ability to only focus the resources or the emphasis on one person, one entity, or one figurehead, whereas the other team fights for the plurality and wants to fight for the focus or the resources or the attention to be shared among multiple individuals or a lot of people or the masses, for instance. For example, in this motion, in teaching history, this house regrets the focus on prominent figures. So prominent figures like Rizal, like Bonifacio, etc. So of course, inside inside government, they want to fight for many because the counterfactual or the comparative of not having prominent figures in history will be to feature events by the masses. Like the revolution is not just headed by one person, it's a collection of multiple katipuneras and katipuneros. The teaching of history now becomes more plural and not just hyper saturated and hyper focused on certain figureheads in history. Whereas opposition wants to retain the status quo, which is that one person gets the big share of the limelight and the lion's share of the attention and acclaim. The next motion is House regrets the romanticization of prominent historical figures in art. So your romanticization, meaning like General Luna, being romanticized by having their own movie, or people like Juan Luna, wherein people romanticize and make poetries about his tendencies to become murderous and psychotic, like by murdering his wife, for instance. So inside government, they regret the romanticization. So they are for many. They want to they don't want art to just be focused on one particular person. They want art to include multiple lay individuals, even when they're not really as famous like in the textbooks. Whereas opposition wants to retain status quo and wants to put one where we still have this romanticization of prominent figures. What are the frames that you can run in the side where you're championing for one? Firstly, you can talk about how this focal person is the best person to properly represent the entire population. Talk about how this particular individual was chosen for a reason, because probably, number one, they are the best at illustrating what happened at the time. They represent the values and the collective beliefs and systems at the time, and that they are the most representative of the era that they were drawn from. The next frame is to say that nobody else could convey the same message as this person. So you can talk about how nobody else, so this person is the pinnacle of a particular virtue or value or moment in history. So absent them, we cannot imagine what history will, because their contributions have been so significant and have been so crucial and pivotal in the happenings of the history. You can also talk about how it's borderline impossible to make history and art still be appreciable by some people or by a lot of people if there's no character, there's no clear person that represents ideals and virtues and values. So hence, it's harder to be able to teach history or teach that kind of thing you want to teach in that aspect. The third thing that you can say as a frame is to say that having one focal person consolidates support for a particular good cause. For instance, if there's only one figurehead, then it's good because then this figurehead becomes the mockingjay of the movement, becomes the mockingjay of the intention or the purpose of the particular rally, and that will actually become better and more palatable in rallying support because it's not like the movement has a clear face and the movement has a concrete understanding of what the value should be as embodied by that person, which then consolidates support pragmatically. And you can also talk about how if there are multiple individuals, you also dilute the message and the narrative because, of course, these individuals will have different interpretations of the message. And the fact or the point at which you feature all of them, your core message becomes heavily, heavily toned down. Conversely, if you're on the side that champions many, you can run certain frames as well. Firstly, you can talk about how one person cannot represent the entire spectrum of sentiments. This is to say that just Jose Rizal or just Andres Bonifacio does not represent the entire sentiments and feelings and plights of all the individuals on the ground in that particular moment in revolution. So you're not able to capture really the main sentiment of all the people concerned in that event. Next is to say that one person cannot consolidate support. And this is where you frame that this person can have a flawed characterization. For instance, in the context of history, you can talk about how Emilio Aguinaldo is not a good figurehead or not a good dominant figure because he also once sold us out to the Americans. Or perhaps you can talk about how if there's resources that's concentrated to one figurehead, then the chances are if that figurehead has been discovered to do something bad, malicious, or obstructing to the cause of the movement, then the whole cause of the movement will also crumble and become moot along with them. Next is to say that one focal person may corrupt the message, such that this person may have undesirable qualities as well because they're just humans. So pouring all your resources and investment on one person may not be the most strategic decision. And lastly, you can talk about how this focal person is likely to be a privileged individual. So in the context of history, Rizal was a privileged person, or Juan Luna was a privileged person. So they are unable to best represent what the people on the ground really feel because they don't understand and haven't suffered the daily plights and sufferings of common men in that particular event. So at that point at which that's true, then you can say that they're not like we regret that they have a disproportionate focus in histories and narratives. I'd like to emphasize that these motions do not just cover history motions, but also cover motions on figureheads or political movements with one central actor. So, are there any questions in one versus many kinds of core debates? Okay, so I'll proceed now. Next is intellectually, the next core debate, the 11th one, so we're already halfway through, is intellectualization versus humanization. So this is where one team fights for something to be intellectualized, for something to be really thought of and meticulously categorized as a medical issue. This can also take the form of a medicalization debate. So something to be really scrutinized and to be truly understood in a manner that's categorable and in a manner that's very, very that can fit into a particular label or a particular box. Whereas humanization, this is where one team fights for something to just be enjoyed and be appreciated for what it is, and not really subjected to an intense process of intellectualization and rationalization. So again, this can be rationalization, intellectualization, medicalization debate. So those are the buzzwords for these kinds of motions. For example, this house supports research that seek to prove the genetic basis of queerness. So that being gay or being trans is a biological thing, right? So now let's go on. Government will prove or like will fight for the side that wants intellectualization because you intellectualize the experience of queerness. Like you want it to be a genetic thing, to be a biological thing. Whereas opposition is focused on humanization because they want to appreciate the phenomenon of queerness and the existence of queer people, not as a biological thing, but just as them and as humans, regardless if it's biological or social or whatever. In the next motion, this House regrets the over-intellectualization of emotions. So over-intellectualization meaning putting so much thought into your emotions or diagnosing yourself with things like anxiety. If you feel like the sadness has been chronic, it's going to be depression, stuff like that. So, of course, government will be for humanization because they don't want that. They regret that. So they want emotions to just be experienced and felt because it's a dimension of being human that's naturally experienced. Whereas opposition wants to intellectualize emotions because they want it to be really understood, to be scrutinized as to what brings up these kinds of emotions, why these emotions exist, and what can we do to suppress or to facilitate the existence of some emotions. So for the frames, if we're on the side that champions intellectualization, we can talk about firstly that intellectualization is necessary for credibility and legitimacy. For instance, you can talk about how queerness, a lot of people don't accept queerness a as an actual concept in their lives because they're very bigoted. So when you prove that it's genetic, that's when it's accepted. Or for instance, anxiety or depression, a lot of people still don't believe in the concept of mental health and feel that these things are just people exaggerating their emotions. So once it's intellectualized, that's when it gains the credibility and legitimacy because you can see that this thing really exists and that's going to lead to things like acceptance. So this is connected with the next frame to say that intellectualization is the perfect response to accusations to say that something is irrational and made up. And you can even talk about something like internal struggles of these individuals, of these people, since these values are typically not understood in society. Emotions, depression, anxiety, queerness. So there's an internal sense of displacement of the self within that particular person. So they're not able to understand themselves sometimes. Give me a sec. Okay, so it's recording, right? Can anybody confirm that it's recording? Okay, so I can just share my screen again. Um, okay, going back, secrecy is when one team is going to argue that something should be kept private or that something should not be exposed to a greater extent in society. For instance, in this motion, in economic recessions, this House believes that information damaging to the market confidence should be kept confidential. So, of course, government should be arguing for secrecy because they want things that will cause investor pull out, capital flight, or mass panic and hysterics to the public to be kept secret. Whereas opposition will want to argue for exposure because they want these things to be exposed and they want these things to be shared to the public. In the motion, this House would prohibit criminals from publishing glorifying or sensationalist accounts of their crimes. So this looks like Jeffrey Dahmer publishing gory accounts of their murders. Then government wants secrecy because they want to silence these kinds of accounts and narratives and not be published. Whereas opposition is for exposure because they feel that these criminals should be allowed to publish these accounts and therefore be spread to more people on the ground. So again, it's not necessarily total secrecy. It's just open and present, but further exposure is already in the exposure side. Okay, so what are the things that we can talk about or frames that we can establish in exposure? Firstly, we can talk about how people deserve to know the truth. So in principle, we can see that people need to understand that this thing is happening and people have the inherent right to know what's going on in their surroundings. Second, we can talk about how exposure breeds due caution. So if this thing is dangerous or if this thing that you're going to expose has dangerous connotations about the future of the world or the uncertainty of everything, then people will be able to be more cautious. And that's when you're able to mitigate a lot of the harms coming from the other team. Because when people know about this, they will become more tactful, they will become more careful, they will become more able to select their actions properly. Next, we can also talk about how withholding information is detrimental to the social contract. That we as individuals in a shared world have the social contract or the unwritten agreement to be able to say to one another what's happening in the world. So At the point at which you're not able to fulfill that, then you're not able to fulfill their social contract in principle. Conversely, the frames that you can run if you're on the side that champions secrecy is to say that exposure does not yield any positive results. So this is when you say that when you expose something, that's when you have things like mass hysteria, panic, people being paranoid, or people being rash, or even people being very selfish because they want to get ahead and put themselves to safety first above everybody else. So when that happens, nothing will come out of that. Okay. Next is that exposure causes harms because it destroys critical thinking. So you just talk about how it infringes on people's ability to make good choices because people are beings are naturally scared, that can be frightened, and are naturally conditioned to be unable to resist all of these things. The next thing that we can say is to analyze that secrecy is the only way to save the world, such that, and this is also where you can use the frames that we ran on the first debate, a core debate, no? Na fine, even if it's wrong, principally, to keep things secret, the pragmatically sound thing, or the thing that's actually good in terms of strategy, is also the principally correct thing. So fine, even if it's wrong that you're keeping things secret from everybody, as long as this secrecy will yield the pragmatically best results, then that is when you actually fulfill the principal good, which is championing the rights, lives, or liberties of people on the ground. So any questions on exposure versus secrecy core debates? Okay. So with that said, I'll go to the next core debate, which is blending in versus standing out. In these debates, one team will be arguing for blending in, i.e. camouflaging on the background, not having extreme qualities that delineate you or set you apart from other people in the population, and just generally being low-key. Whereas the other team will be arguing for standing out, and that you should be bold enough to be the confident you, that even at the extent of you sticking out like a sore thumb, that you're proud of that identity and that you should stand out. For instance, in this motion, this house believes that this house as a first-gen immigrant would assimilate in the culture of a new country. So a first-gen immigrant meaning that you are a person who's just who just traveled to a foreign land and now you're living there. So you're the first-gen immigrant. You're the first person of your family to still go there and live there. So you don't have like mothers or fathers who've already come there and live with you. So yeah. So as government, the government team would be arguing for blending in because they want this first-gen immigrant to perhaps not practice their own religion publicly, perhaps adapt to the language and the accent of that particular country that they have been living in right now. Whereas opposition is going to argue for standing out, that they want this immigrant to really become themselves, even at the expense of standing out. So what are the frames that you can run when you're in a team that says you should blend in? Firstly, you can talk about how blending in is a lifeline. Frame it as a lifeline. And it saves you from enduring major damages. You can talk about how if you stand out, you're going to be prone to attacks, you're going to be prone to abuse just because you are different, because people are bigoted and people will come and get you because of the disparity of your identity to them. So if you're blending in, that's when you're able to shield yourself from a lot of these harms. Secondly, you can talk about how blending in is a necessary adaptation that you are principally entitled to make. So fine, even if it's denying your culture, denying your identity, the fact of the matter is it's a necessary thing for you to do. And you're principally entitled to that because you're beholden to yourself to survive and not to any other culture or not to any other identity. So even if it's shady in principle, it's still morally correct because your moral principle should dictate you to survive. Next is that the world will hate you if you stick out like a sore thumb. So this is like similar to this one. And lastly, you can talk about how identity is more overrated. So there's really nothing that you can gain from being the person that you were in a different country, especially since now you're in a different context. So it's an overrated concept that will not feed you at the end of the day. Next is that, conversely, when you're standing out, you can talk about how once you forgo your identity, you also deny yourself a chance at genuine happiness. So perhaps you can frame that the incentive structures of these individuals, their extent of happiness is contingent on their ability to still look at themselves in the mirror and see a person that they know and recognize. So once you take it away from them because you blend in too much, then you're not able to be happy. You will be safe, but you will never truly be happy and you will never truly feel at home in that particular country. Next is that you can talk about how the world is not more is now pala, sorry, it's W, is now more accommodating to people who are different. So, for instance, you can talk about the context of liberalization and that a lot of countries are heavily westernized. So, there's a decrease in racism or extreme values. There's greater acceptance to things like queer people, etc. So, there are now more individuals who are more accepting of differences, and that's why even if you are different, then that's fine because you mitigate a lot of the harms that are posited to you by the other team. Next is that blending in is a denial of your culture and identity. So it's a denial of who you are. And next, you can talk about how blending is in. Blending in breeds self-loathing. That at the end of the day, when you blend in too much, you no longer recognize the person that you are. And then you're going to hate yourself from all the choices. And you can extend on a lot of the things and arguments on self-loathing and why it's bad, why you hate yourself in a foreign country where nobody else could offer that counter narrative for you to love yourself because you're away from your friends and family at home. Any other questions for blending in and standing out? None? Okay. Next is fulfillment versus money. So this is when one team will argue for fulfillment, such that the ability to be happy with yourself and to feel contentment with your life should be the main priority of the actor. Whereas one team will also argue that the ability to be financially stable, to have money, to have be able to provide for your basic needs and your wants is the way to go and is the reason for that person's existence, etc. For this motion, his house prefers jobs that pay well over jobs that fulfills one's passion. So quite directly, government is the side that argues for money because they want a job that pays well, and opposition is the side that argues for fulfillment. Conversely, in the motion, this house as a pandemic graduate would opt for freelance jobs that pay less. Of course, side government is arguing for fulfillment because they're willing to want freelance jobs. So even if these jobs are not lucrative in terms of pay, the fact that these jobs grant you more liberty over your time, and that's fulfillment. So they're arguing for fulfillment. Meanwhile, opposition is arguing for money because they want a 9 to 5 job that pays well and has a more clear-cut vision of climbing the corporate ladder and career mobility. So that's why they're arguing for money. So what are the frames that you can run when you're on the side that argues for fulfillment? Firstly, you can say that agency, empowerment, and fulfillment are things that money can never afford. So even in the best case of the other side, where they have so much money, these are the things that they cannot buy. And fulfillment will only happen if you choose to be happy with the job and the choices and the path that you take in your life. Second, you can talk about how letting go of passion and fulfillment equates to choosing suffering because you're essentially choosing to live a life every day of wanting to get out of your job or of your life because you're no longer able to you're no longer able to choose these things anymore. So that's why like you will hate yourself for that. So next is that no salary is worth a severe amount of suffering. So money can't buy you happiness. Secondly, money can also, if you're on the side that frames why money is important, you'll talk about how money is the prerequisite for all the joys in life. So you can't be happy without money. And money is the pathway to more control and power over one's life. And that letting go of money is a form of self-neglect because you need money to buy things that can make you happy, things that can actually ensure your survival in the long term and in the long term of your family. And you can even frame money as the reason for you to gain empowerment and agency. Because when you have money, you can have choices on what to buy, on where to travel, where to go, or like you won't be subservient to bosses or to other people for your daily sustenance and your enjoyment in your life. So, okay. Next frame is individualist versus collectivist. So in this motion, in this type of core debate, one team will be arguing for the individual and them being selfish, and the other team will argue for the collective, or like having a shared or mutual uh, goal to be able to uplift the community. So in this example, no, this house regrets the premium placed on kapwa. So of course, kapwa being the other, like other people. So government wants to fight for individualists because they don't want the premium placed in kapwa. Now position is collectivist. So here, the individualist frames can be that the individual has no moral responsibility over other people, that you don't owe them anything or any favors. And you can also frame your arguments in a way that talks about how the individual's potential is chained down by the collective. You're not able to achieve your best version of yourself because you're talking about other people and they're dragging you down. Or that you can talk about how individualism is the only way to fully practice one's agency, and that you don't have free will and choice if you become too collective and become like embodying the hive mind of the collective. Next, you can under the collectivist frame, you can talk about how humans are social beings in nature. So therefore, they really survive through time through collectivism. Like you can talk about how in the olden times, in the like we survived because of the hunter-gatherer systems wherein humans were cooperating with one another to be able to provide food and shelter for the community. And that we are social beings. So by nature, we are meant to be collectivist. You can talk also about collectivism is a cultural response to oppression or collective suffering, such that bayanihan is a way to respond to like oppressive individuals and people who take advantage of us at the end of the day. So next, like ban versus regulation. Quite frankly, no, this one team argues for the ban, while the other team just wants regulation. So in this house, we legalize the use of sale of psychedelic drugs. The other team wants to legalize with regulations, and the other team wants to ban completely. Whereas in this house would ban all forms of research related to human genome editing, one team will want to ban completely, Gov will want to ban completely, versus OP want to just regulate it. So next, for the frames, no, here, for ban, the activity is a national threat or an emergency, which no average citizen must have access to. So the activity is far too dangerous to just simply regulate, and therefore, as an average citizen, we should ban it. We can also talk about how bans show the uncompromising stance of the state against major threats. So talk about how ban really is the best way to send the message across that this thing is dangerous and this thing is an emergency. Thirdly, you can talk about the legalization and how it encourages and legitimizes public interest on threatening and dangerous activities. So when you legalize it, that means to say that you're also okay, like that sends a soft stance against this particular thing. And some people might have the idea of thinking that this isn't so dangerous because it's legal anyway. Whereas in regulation, you can talk about how regulation is the only way to monitor, evaluate, and correct activities. So you can only talk about how if you regulate, that's when you don't incentivize things like black markets from happening. Because when you ban something, people will still have demand for it, and that something will go underground or become black market, like drugs, for instance. But when you regulate, you can monitor the activities and actually like act accordingly and actually respond to threats onto that particular idea. Next is that regulation is the only way to safeguard and guard humanity from the risk of the activities. So it's the only way to protect humanities. And banning does not disincentivize the activity, it only encourages black markets. So you can talk about how information awareness only exists when once it's not banned, but it's regulated rather, because people will now have the incentive to know about it, and that's when the government can spread information about it as well. Next is that people versus superstructures. This is when one side will argue for people such that people are just victims of circumstances and that they're not deserving of the punishment. Whereas superstructures, the team here argues that these are things that are absolutely bad and that these are consciously and maliciously made, and therefore they should be penalized accordingly. For instance, in the motion, this house would criminalize the spread of fake news. Government will argue that it's the superstructure's fault. Fake news is a superstructure that we should ban and we should criminalize. Whereas opposition would argue that no, the people spreading fake news are just people who are victims of circumstances of misinformation and because they were uneducated. The next motion is how supports the rise of vigilante groups in high crime rate areas. So in this motion, this is this argues that the vigilante groups are just people because they are just concerned in their areas, whereas opposition will argue that they are superstructures that we should regret and we should not actually support because they are malicious and are actually doing harm. So for people, our frames are that firstly, it's not their fault that they did the crimes and they're just victims of circumstances. No, superstructures like states and patriarchy are to blame for the irresponsible behavior, like or poverty, for instance. That criminals are just doing crimes because they have been forced by the state because of negligence and that they have been forced to endure long days without eating and starving themselves. That's why they were pushed into the extremes. Thirdly, we can say as well that penalizing victims is a form of enabling and supporting superstructures' failure to take the accountability. So we're skirting the blame to the people on the ground who didn't know any better and who were just victims of superstructures like poverty and patriarchy instead of actually fixing the structures themselves. So it's a very reactive and it's a problem solution mismatch. Next, for superstructures, we can say that individuals should be accountable for their own actions despite circumstances. So people still consciously chose to spread fake news. So even if they were miseducated, the fact that they consciously choose to do that means that they are liable for those actions. Second, we say that blaming superstructures justifies the crimes committed by people. So we're actually freeing them of accountability. And it's also a failure to penalize criminals because it's an insult. If you don't penalize criminals, it's an insult and a disservice to their victims because the people whom they have victimized will not be able to achieve justice because of these kinds of things, because we're not able to penalize their perpetrators. Next is pedestal versus critical. This is where one team will argue that something should be held at a pedestal and should be hailed as a value in society that should be celebrated. Whereas one team will argue in a more critical interpretation that we should be critical about these values and be able to diagnose and assess their flaws. For instance, in this motion, this House regrets the idealized version of democracy from the US. Opposition, idealized version, meaning that we're going to glorify democracy from the US. Of course, opposition, government wants critical because they want us to be critical of the democracy, whereas opposition will be pedestal because they want us to set democracy in a high pedestal. Next is this House regrets the glorification of geniuses. So government will be critical because they want us to be critical of geniuses and not immediately give them things like social benefits and social clout and acclaim, whereas opposition wants to do pedestal because they want to maintain that geniuses should be set apart from society and should be held at a higher standard. For pedestal, we can talk about how it's the only way for us to champion the good that these things represent if we put them in the pedestal. So the only way for us to really send a strong message that these are good things, if democracy, for instance, is a good thing, is if we put them at the pedestal. Because if we don't put them at the pedestal, then they're more prone to criticisms and to other things that can rebut them and can refute their usefulness and value in society. We can also talk about how these are things that are offering counter narratives to very pervasive societal problems. Like, for example, democracy offers a counter narrative against dictatorships or autocratic governments. So if putting them in pedestal amplifies their message, it also helps us eradicate pervasive and pertinent social problems in society. Because pedestal means that if there's a platform and when you can also preempt and flip the arguments of critical, right? Because you can say that, of course, critical will say that no, we need to be critical and we need to scrutinize these values because these values can have some harmful nuances. You can talk about how when there's a pedestal, you can put things in a platform, and by putting them in a platform, there's more scrutiny. So you can examine these things. Like we can police when democracy becomes bad or when democracy becomes used for evil. So next, we can also talk about how there are ways to mitigate the harms that are accrued when you put things in pedestal. Like there are corrective mechanisms, like society is more liberal now, there are people who will backlash, etc. So critical. So you can talk about how placing things in a pedestal disables us from seeing the bad in them. So if it's a bad person being glorified, then we're not able to critique them because we just feel that they're perfect and they're immune to criticism. You also turn a blind eye on their flaws, which can be harmful because their flaws can be exacerbated, and they can use their platform and their power to actually do something bad. Like the US, for instance, like we're not able to critique its flaws when it's doing shady things in the international arena or to other poorer countries. Also, putting something on a pedestal rejects diversity of perspectives. It's because we're already saying that this is the one and true thing that we should hail, and therefore any other perspectives that can be good are already put at the back seat. And when something becomes criticized, it becomes a harmful, hardened notion that's far harder to challenge in society. Next is that um, damaging versus uplifting. So one team will argue that a narrative or a thing is damaging to society, and one thing will argue it's uplifting. So in a world now, this house prefers a world wherein forgiveness is not a virtue, no? So of course, government will be arguing that it's damaging, that forgiveness being a virtue has been damaging to society. Whereas one where opposition will argue that it's uplifting, forgiveness being a value actually is uplifting. So the frames of said government could be that power asymmetry makes us prone to abuse, such that one team will have like a powerful entity in society that's evil has disproportionate access and power to use the narrative to their will. For instance, it's going to be the oppressors, like the Marcoses, for instance, or the people who have been in political dynasties to use the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue and therefore be able to smoothen out their optics and perfume their image to the lay people. And then these individuals will be making the same mistakes again of trusting the wrong people. There's power asymmetry on how the narrative is applied and who is able to make the most use of this narrative to do their own bidding and to do their own interests. So it can also means that it can be weaponized against minorities or weaker members in society. Uplifting means that we can talk about how these values of social good and improve social personal growth and interpersonal relationships, that they have been good in actually maintaining cohesion in society, and talk about how these values have contributed in allowing communities to grow and survive. So as notice that in motions like this house prefers a world where forgiveness is not a virtue. Please note that this is really the core debate. Don't do anything else that's not damaging versus uplifting. Because you can't say that in opposition, okay, like we don't prefer a world where forgiveness is a virtue. Rather, we prefer a world wherein forgiveness is a belief or a value or something like that. Because forgiveness has to be held at a higher standard. Like you can't do all those things because the debate is asking you to defend damaging versus uplifting. So you can't become a second government team and say that it's not a virtue on our side, but it's a value, it's something else, it's a belief. No, like you need to really argue why it's damaging. If it's not a virtue, then it's damaging. Okay, so next and last, actually, no, a core debate between bad representation and no representation. This house regrets the rise of boys love media. So essentially, one team will argue that bad representation is okay as long as there is representation, whereas the other team will argue that no, we would rather have no representation at all if the representation is actually bad. So, for instance, in this motion, this house regrets the rise of boy love media or BL media, which are portrayals of gay love on online or in media. So of course, government will argue for no representation because they would rather have no representation if it's bad representation, because they would argue that boys love media is very unrealistic. It does not represent the struggles of people on the ground, and the queer individuals are not represented and are excluded actually because the BL media only hires like straight actors and very like conform to heteronormative conventions that are untrue and uncongruent to the queer experiences of individuals on the ground. Whereas opposition will actually be signing for bad representation. So they will not regret the rise. So they're okay with the rise because they think that bad representation is still representation and it still is able to transition into more better representation in the future. So let's go to the frames. If you're arguing for bad representation, to talk about how visibility is the most crucial thing for minorities and has been stripped off for the longest time. So these minorities have been invisible for the longest time. They don't see themselves in TV, in media, or they don't have any positive representation. So the fact that they're now visible, even if the representation is not perfect, and that's okay. Second, you can talk about how bad representation can be corrected and can be a stepping stone for better representation. So this can be your frame as well. You can talk about things like microdosing. Microdosing is the concept of exposing a group to a certain concept little by little at each time, and that increases their ability to be receptive and to accept those kinds of changes and become more palatable to those changes at the end of the day. So bad representations can be corrected, but if we have representations right now, that's when you get the bigots and the majority to be microdosed and accept those kinds of representations, and through time, accept queer rights and these individuals as human beings that are of equal dignity to them. Next is that we can talk about how there's no representation means that it's the society that will have the full control over the narratives of the minorities, and that's far worse. So if you don't have any representation, then it's the bigots that will actually interpret what these minorities look like, how they should act, and that's far worse because you have nothing and you're not able to be seen in society as a whole. So the next one is no representation. So on this side, we can talk about how bad representation is severely damaging to the communities that have historically done all the efforts to clear their name. So bad representation will actually backtrack the progress of the movement. So if the minority is fighting for their rights, bad representation can actually undo all the progress that has been done. For instance, if the representation of Black people is blackface and it's just white people with charcoal or like black ink on their faces, and it's gonna undo a lot of the representation because it's still gonna perpetuate the stereotypes and the notions that these Black people are not worthy of rights and not worthy of representation. And it's gonna undo things and progress from the Black Lives Movement. Secondly, bad representation reinforces harmful narratives, and this then burdens the path of legitimacy. And then it's harder to gain respect for these individuals on the ground because it reinforces stereotypes and notions and things that are untrue and are unrepresentative of these minorities on the ground. So I hope that it's clear to you like how you will approach these kinds of motions. So these are the motions that will these are the kinds of core debates that will appear. No, please note two things. Number one, these core debates can overlap. They're not mutually exclusive. So one motion can have two or three core debates, and it's up to you to be able to diagnose and sniff them out. Second, make sure that you understand how one core like how the core debate should be used. Do not stray too far from core debate. This is not to say that you shouldn't be running inventive and very amazing extensions or ideas. By all means, you should be doing that, but it should still be at the proximity and the premise of core debate. Because if you deviate too far and if you take on burdens that are not yours, then that's a recipe for disaster. And you might not even be arguing for the actual thing that your side should be arguing. For instance, in a motion, this house this house celebrates forgiveness as a value. This house celebrates the belief of kapwa, diba? So if you're opposition, you should really be saying that you're individualist, that you don't want kapwa. You're rejecting the concept of collectivist natures of kapwa. You can't be saying, okay, like we will not celebrate kapwa as a belief because we're celebrating kapwa as a value, as a virtue, something higher. No, because the core debate is damaging versus uplifting. So if you're not the uplifting part, you can't be the second uplifting team. You should be the more damaging team or arguing why that narrative is damaging. So with that said, these are the core debates, no? So again, it's the most basic form of the debate, and it's a debate without any of the complexities. So it's a war without the guns and the tanks and the nuclear weapons. It's just the ideological conflict. What is the base premise of the tension of the motion? And for example, the core, it's in the middle of everything. The debate should revolve around that. You can run fantastic, crazy, amazing frames that's inventive, fresh, and new, but it should still be nuanced to the core debate. Otherwise, you will be boxed out. So with that said, we're running short on time, no? I also have somewhere to be. But I like we can entertain a few questions. Do you guys have any questions? Answer? Okay. So with that said, no, you can email me your questions to the email. You guys are notified because I'm sending email blasts for the updates as well. Secondly, you can put the questions on Discord. And thirdly, you can message me on Messenger. So if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to approach me. Okay. But I hope that you really understand core debates because I like I found that when I was a younger debater, nobody taught me like really the core debates, and that's why it was hard for me to understand like and to put myself in the round and understand the nuance right away. So right now, as early as your early or intermediate careers, knowing that the core debates will really go a long way in making sure that you have the right context, have the right frames, and have the right arguments. Okay. So any other questions? Last chance. There are no questions. So thank you everybody for listening. And if you don't mind, can you all turn on our cameras for a quick photo? Thank you. But if it's okay as well if you're you know laying down in bed and you don't want to turn on your camera, so I understand. So that's fine. It's been a long day. It's such a rainy day. So I hope that thank you everybody for attending 2 lectures today, even though it's quite rainy and the weather is quite inclement. So thank you everybody. I hope to see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we will talk about the matter for common motion themes and judging. Okay? So thank you everybody. Have a wonderful day.